Let me give a welcome to those here at the Middle East Institute and others who are joining us remotely for this afternoon's program. Does the U.S. policy towards the Taliban need rethinking? The Middle East Institute is the oldest Washington-based institute dedicated to the study of the Middle East region. That when it was founded in 1946 and encompassed in its orbit Afghanistan and the following year, Pakistan. As a nonpartisan think tank, MEI provides expert, timely policy analysis, a popular language program, a renowned scholarly journal, a fine library, and has emerged as a showcase exhibiting Middle East arts and culture. I'm Marvin Weinbaum, director of MEI's Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies program, and I'm pleased to host and moderate today's panel. You know, it wasn't long ago that many policy makers here in Washington, and for that much of the American public, was convinced that following our military withdrawal from Afghanistan, we could put the country and its many disappointments behind us. Yet nearly 2 years later, we find ourselves, along with much of the international community, still seriously concerned with Afghanistan and having to deal with a Taliban regime. It's proven impossible to ignore the country's worsening humanitarian crisis, the possibility that it could again serve as a breeding ground for global terrorists, the pleas for evacuation of tens of thousands of Afghans who assisted American operations over the course of 20 years. It's been difficult to close our's to the Taliban's tightening restrictions on the rights of women and girls and their stiflingly narrow rule. But for all the diplomatic and economic pressure that the US and others have brought to bear against the Taliban government to alter its policies, we have little to show for it. Although the regime seeks political recognition and economic assistance, its leaders are not prepared to give way on anything they define as involving upholding Islamic principle. This naturally leads us to ask whether, in ways consistent with our security and strategic objectives and the best interests of the people of Afghanistan, that we should consider approaching the Taliban any differently. Are there policies that, even if they fail to induce changes we might hope for, could mitigate what we today find so disturbing about a Taliban regime that may be around for some time? To address these and related issues, we have a distinguished panel to which we will now turn. Over much of the next hour, we will hear from our panelists, after which we will invite audience questions for the final 30 or so minutes of the program. Those here at MEI, please raise your hand to pose a question, and you'll be provided with a microphone. Those who have joined us remotely can use the Q&A option on your screen. So, panelists, let's turn first to Lisa Curtis. Lisa is a former senior director for South and Central Asia in the White House National Security Council, and has worked for over 20 years as a foreign policy and security expert. She has been a senior fellow on South Asia at the Heritage Foundation, a staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with the South Asia portfolio, a senior advisor in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, a senior analyst at CIA, and early in her career served at the embassies in Pakistan and India. So Lisa, please.
Thank you so much, Marv, and it's great to be here, but I do want to make one correction.
Please.
I was a senior advisor in the State Department's South Asia Bureau, working closely with Don Camp, who happens to be
Who's here right now.
But I was briefed a lot by INR and spent a lot of time with you all, so maybe that's why you thought I was INR.
I thought maybe after I left. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So thank you for inviting me here today. It's a really important topic, and I'm really glad to see all of you that have come out to hear about it. And I want to start by talking about the human rights situation in Afghanistan, because what we are seeing is really a human rights calamity unfolding in Afghanistan. We are seeing the extreme persecution of women to a degree that we haven't seen really in the last century in any other country in the world. And I think it demands all of our immediate attention. The latest move, of course, was to mandate the closure of all beauty shops, which I understand will leave thousands of women in the country unemployed. I have also heard that they are closing teacher training centers, which will leave another about 4,000 Afghan women unemployed. This, of course, follows the mandate that Afghan women could no longer work for the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, as well as edicts banning women from attending school past the 6th grade, closing universities to women, preventing women from leaving their homes without a male companion, and prohibiting women from going to parks, gyms, and holding most jobs. So again, I want to say this is extreme gender persecution. This goes beyond discrimination. That's simply not a strong enough word, in my opinion, to describe what is happening to the women and girls of Afghanistan. So let's talk about terrorism. The latest UN sanctions monitoring report that was released last month tells us that terrorist groups of all stripes are proliferating in the country. They're unhindered by the Taliban, the one exception being Islamic State Khorasan Province, or ISKP. But the UN report notes that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda remain closely aligned. Even if Al-Qaeda may be lying low and biding its time for now, the report essentially says, and I'll quote, "With the patronage of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda members have received appointments and advisory roles in the Taliban security and administrative structures." And it goes on to say that relations between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are strong and symbolic. Unfortunately, despite the Taliban's extreme persecution of women and its continued ties to Al-Qaeda, what we hear is that the Biden administration appears interested in trying to cooperate with the Taliban on countering terrorism, rather than marshaling the international community to oppose the Taliban's anti-women policies and continued connections to international terrorist groups. I believe this is short-sighted, and I don't believe that it will serve U.S. national security interests over the long term. Seeking to engage the Taliban on terrorism while ignoring what they are doing to women is a mistake. The fact that the United States and the Taliban both happen to oppose ISKP does not make the Taliban a good CT partner for the United States. First, the Taliban will fight ISKP on its own, with or without US assistance. Second, as I've pointed out, Taliban remains closely allied with Al-Qaeda. And third, what we see is the Taliban is opening new madrasas, which will basically inculcate a whole new generation of young men with their brand of Islam thus breeding a new generation of extremists, many of whom will likely become terrorists. So if US officials are interested in providing information to the Taliban on ISKP, fine. But I don't think that Washington should feel a need to reward the Taliban if they go after ISKP targets. As I indicated, they will do this on their own volition. And US officials should instead be focusing their attention, their resources, their diplomacy on seeking improvement in the treatment of women and girls. And while the United States and its international partners may not be able to immediately impact the Taliban decision-making on policies towards women and girls, as Marv pointed out, that doesn't mean they should stop attempting to do so. I think that US officials should be conditioning their engagement with the Taliban on how they are treating women and girls, and implement further human rights sanctions on Taliban leaders. I think US officials should also increase engagement with political opposition leaders and expatriate Afghans who do support human rights. And, you know, if we look at Afghanistan, the women of Afghanistan are bravely standing up for themselves. At CNAS, we have been able to document at least 86 women-led protests in the last 20 months. 32 of these demonstrations were held indoors, with protesters getting their message out through Facebook, through videos, and other social media postings. So, you know, that tells us, you know, the women are standing up for themselves. The international community needs to be there with them and fighting for their rights. So let me just well, first I want to point out that there's wonderful work being done at USIP by Belkis Ahmadi. She is publishing a monthly tracker of the situation for women. So she's spelling out what exactly is happening on the ground with women. She has documented an increase in female suicides. She has also shown that there are almost daily decrees being issued by the Taliban that are impacting human rights, especially those of women and girls. And her work is showing that violence against women is likely to increase as boys and men are being encouraged to enforce Taliban restrictions on women and girls in their own families and to punish them. So it's only likely a matter of time before the Taliban sanctions domestic violence. If that happens, we should expect a gendercide to begin. So pressuring the Taliban now to change course on its policies toward women and girls will not only demonstrate that the United States still stands up for its values and principles, it will also help dampen support for extremism and prevent the resurgence of terrorism in the region and beyond. So what I'm saying is human rights, the treatment of women is directly connected to terrorism trends in the country. And US policymakers should not forget that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Let's next turn to Douglas London. Doug is a retired CIA senior operations officer with 34 years of service in the Middle East, Africa, South and Central Asia. He writes extensively on national security issues and is widely quoted in the media. His articles and op-eds have appeared in leading journals, and he's the author of a book on spying and the lost art of American intelligence. Currently, Doug is a non-resident scholar here at the Middle East Institute and an adjunct professor, associate professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Doug?
Thanks very much, Ambassador. It's a delight to be here. It's my first time being here since I've been a non-resident fellow, and I've been literal about non-resident. First of all, I want to say I am in violent agreement with Lisa's depiction of events in Afghanistan and the Taliban. Violent agreement, I love that. It's a phrase I got from a boss at the CIA. It's designed to show that we are in the same place in terms of what we see going on there. But I'm going to butcher a quote from CIA Director Burns in his recent remarks in England and then in an op-ed in the Washington Post, in which he talked about the importance of human relationships and intelligence. It's important to be talking to your friends, to your enemies, and cultivating those in between. And the reason for that is very calculated and deliberate. It's an effort to gain insight into events on the ground, into planning and thinking among the various players that will inform policy, another great intelligence community buzzword, inform policy. But that policy then is supposed to achieve US national security interests, which over the last 20 years in Afghanistan haven't always been terribly clear nor consistent. And I'm not going to steal Ambassador Newman's thunder. He makes a great remark about that. But where I probably defer, and hopefully only slightly with Lisa, is that in dealing with a regime like the Taliban, you have to look at it realistically in terms of what it has in its favor, its dynamics, many of which we don't understand, and our ability to influence that with some form of currency. And that currency can be carrot, that currency can be stick. And I think Lisa mentioned both actually in some of her remarks, what we should do to try to punish and perhaps how we could reward the Taliban at times to encourage better behavior. I have no illusions about the Taliban. It's an emotional issue, particularly for Afghans and those of us who've been there in Afghanistan, who've lost friends, Afghan and American and others all alike. And I was a spy. So I don't believe in good faith and just, oh yeah, they've changed their ways. I believe in actions and spying that will tell me if they're really doing what they say they're going to do. That's really hard to do when you're not on the ground. And I know Washington speaks at the White House over the horizon, and over horizon gets you something. It's largely remote in terms of intelligence, but it's not the same as having a presence on the ground, an official presence on the ground, something that might only be ascertained by recognition of the Taliban, which does not convoke agreement with what they're doing, support for what they're doing, or an incentive to continue the same horrendous policies and actions. But I have on my mind from what I've seen firsthand over the years, the Taliban is not homogeneous. None of them are progressive in any way, but they have different interests that can be influenced and incentivized. But in order to have the currency to accomplish that, you also need engagement, you need understanding. So as an intelligence professional or former intelligence professional, I would like to see the United States have an official presence on the ground, not just in Kabul, but particularly in Kandahar, where most of the leadership decisions are being made. I'm not saying that's easy. I don't frankly know if it's feasible, but I think we have to start with the reality of what's going on the ground. And the reality is the United States is already talking to the Taliban. State Department's talking to the Taliban, the CIA is talking to the Taliban, outside the country, maybe inside the country, who's to say? There's already cooperation on the Islamic State, which I think is a form of currency in one form. But we see fractures and differences in that leadership group. We see the Haqqanis, we see Muhammad Yaqub, and we see, of course, Akhundzada and his inner circle, something that I know Javed will speak to with much greater depth than I possibly can. And having a better understanding of what's going on will allow the US to maybe play the game a bit more effectively, a bit more scrupulously, to try to achieve these very goals that I think we're all on the same page for, which is addressing the horrendous human rights situation, addressing the Taliban's horrific treatment of women and their destabilizing presence and activities in the region, which I very much agree contribute to the instability of its regional neighbors. Look at Pakistan. We could speak all day about that. Look at Al-Qaeda, which, in contrary to what the president said, they're there, and their presence there is a benefit to them and a danger for us. But as emotional as it is for all of us, I believe we need to look at what's going on the ground and determine a path forward that may not seem terribly popular with many who have rightful hurt and pain and loss and suffering, but will actually get the very goals that we all have in common, which is American and Afghan security interests and those of their neighbors there to avoid what could be a rather catastrophic confluence of events, because I don't think things are going to get more stable in Afghanistan if we stay out of it, and we're already very much into it. So I think we should leverage the currency that we can use to better achieve our results.
Thank you. Ron? Ronald Newman formerly served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and was, as many of you know, Ambassador to Afghanistan from 2005 to 2007. After having served as ambassador to Algeria and Bahrain for over 3 decades, held numerous diplomatic posts across the Middle East. He's currently president of the American Academy of Diplomacy and writes regularly articles and opinion pieces, and contributes to reports on Afghanistan, Middle East, and related topics. Ron holds the distinguished position of career member of the Senior Foreign Service.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for doing this. I think, I'm struck as I listen to my colleagues, how much we will agree on analysis and how we will probably not, I wouldn't say disagree, but not fully line up on various aspects of policy. Is this working, by the way? Okay. Yeah.
Can we make that loud?
All right, well, I can holler. Or maybe we'll get closer to me, I don't know. Anyway, so reflecting on that complexity, it just struck me that it's worth having a conference like, a discussion like this, which has a little bit more time than the 800-word limit of the op-ed to get to some nuances. So I'm going to start up because you wanted the focus, or you focused the title anyway. I don't know if you meant it, but you focused the title on policy.
I meant it.
So I'm going to suggest, first of all, that this is a time in which we have a policy in which it is almost impossible to actually have a strategy. Because a strategy is how you achieve a goal. Now, the goals, I think one could lay out fairly broadly, clearly, change on women, counterterrorism, stability in the region, and continuing exfiltration, evacuation, whatever you want to call it, of people to whom we have a vast moral debt that we really have not paid off. That's fine. That's a policy. A strategy is how you achieve a policy. It's like a roadmap, a vehicle to get, you want to go someplace. Except if you can't figure out the road and you have no vehicle, you don't have a strategy. And effectively, that's where we are now. We do not have the means of either compulsion or reward sufficient to move anything in particular to our desired policy ends right now. That doesn't mean there's nothing you can do or you give up and you walk away. It's just an understanding that no, a series of actions is not a strategy. We do this all the time in the State Department. You want a strategy, people write you a memo with a whole list of actions. Yeah. I want to go to the moon. I'm jumping up and down. 50% of my actions go in the right direction. I'm not going to get a lift off. That's not a strategy. That's an action list. It's fine. It's useful, but it's not a strategy. So in the absence of a coherent strategy, not because we don't want one, but because I don't think we have the means to have one, there are a number of things you have to think about doing. One of them is pressures where you have pressures. Another one is maintaining contact with the Taliban. First of all, for all the reasons that Doug laid out very well. Secondly, because if there is at some point change, you want to be able to react to change. And if you cut off contact, which some people talk about, you have a terrible time resuming, because then it becomes a domestic political issue that you have to show that there have been sufficient change on the other party in order to pick up the contact again. And so you become immobilized. You painted yourself into a corner where if there's change, you can't react to it. or you give the contact away to some agency of the US government that isn't really responsible to you. That's not a solution. So one principle, I think it's very important, is to maintain contact. Then the question is, how do you do that? Because if you, a second, what I would say principle is you don't give something for nothing. Yeah, we have a long tradition of that, by the way. We've really helped the Taliban figure out that if you don't move, we'll move. So why should you move? You know, we gave them 5 prisoners out of Guantanamo for Bo Bergdahl. We gave them Haqqani high-profile people back to get innocent professors released. We made not every conceivable, but a great many compromises in Doha. And then we just did it again recently in a hostage exchange for this guy Friedrichs. We gave them back a fellow named Haji Bashir Nurzai, who's been in jail for drugs for years. And that isn't even a Taliban issue. That's a Nurzai tribal issue. Karzai wanted him back too. I remember meeting for probably 50 Nurzai tribal leaders to explain why we weren't giving him back then. But the result is we have, over an extended period of time in 3 administrations, repeatedly given back people that are high profile for people that are low profile to nearly no value. That has, you know, that's a lived experience that has taught them something about negotiating with us, and ain't good. So one principle is you maintain contact. Another principle is that you don't, you know, for promises, you can give promises. You give actions for actions. Now, I would like to see us back in Kabul, by the way, for the reasons Doug mentioned. The problem is that having now made that a highly symbolic action, which they would like, it's a problem. How do you do that without appearing to have, again, a concession? So it's probably premature, but it's desirable. We need to explain to our American public that we are going to have to operate on what you might say on the margin or in the gray areas with a lot of nuance. That clear cut, you know, we will deal or we will not deal is probably not going to be possible. For one thing, because we still want to get people out, and that requires Taliban cooperation. And it doesn't mean you should be giving a lot, but it's also an issue. We also need a maximum degree of regional cooperation because that's where you get your most pressure. That cooperation has held together pretty well on many respects, both on the issue of women, on non-recognition. I think it's fraying a little at the edge. At least what I heard after the last meetings in Dushanbe was that there is growing regional fear of economic collapse inside Afghanistan and what that might generate in terms of refugees and movements. So there is, I don't know how strong that is, but there's a certain regional pressure because their lead issues are not women. Their lead issues are security and counterterrorism, and not having refugee flows, things like that. So there's a potential for a split there. And we have to manage that. You don't capitulate to it. You have to manage. So I think we are going to have a long period in which we are muddling through. And then we have one other interest, which is the well-being of the Afghan populace at large in terms of food. And you have a large part of the population right now that is living in food scarcity. And we have a certain amount of responsibility to that population, partly because they're in the problem they are, because after 20 years of having the whole economy slanted in one direction, partly through our presence as well as our policies, we've now left it the way it is. You can't just say, well, tough, that's not us. We have a responsibility. That gets you into the middle of one of these really sticky gray areas. How? Because everything is going to be nuanced. This isn't going to be a place where you can have a clear policy. And God, we hate it when we can't have a clear policy, especially one we can express in 750 to 800 words. They're not bad. But in fact, if you are going to help feed people and keep them alive, there will be some leakage of funds to the Taliban. You're not going to be able to have a firewall. It's going to be a matter of degree. How much can you prevent? How can you keep it clamped down? How do you keep your eye on it at a very high level of detail? But it's not going to be a yes or no question. You can have no. You can have no aid to Afghans. If you have aid to Afghans, you have leakage, and then you cannot have a yes or no question. So you're going to have some leakage. How do you manage it? There are things you can do. Again, each one of these areas will reveal things you can do, but they won't necessarily change the policy. So just one that I've advocated is, we have about $500 million of private Afghan money frozen in this country because it was in Afghan banks, and the Afghan banks placed it in deposits in American banks for safekeeping, they thought. And with the fall of the regime, those funds have been frozen along with everybody else's. We have absolutely no moral right to that money. It is not Taliban money. It belongs to private Afghans. Giving it back, it wouldn't all go into, some of it would get instantly moved to Dubai or something. But, giving it back would be a shot in the arm to the Afghan economy. Letting banks transfer money for transactions which are legal would help the Afghan economy. Right now, there are a whole lot of transactions that Citibank, as I understand it, principally Citibank, maybe some others, won't authorize because they're afraid of jeopardy, even though they've been told the actions are legal. Well, if you don't want to spend more billions of US taxpayer money for keeping Afghans alive, then it would help to let the Afghan economy function to the extent it can outside of Taliban control. I personally think you would be a lot better off if you were transferring money via Citibank to Afghan banks rather than in pallet loads of cash to the UN, via the UN. You'd have a lot more chain of custody and tracking. So to my mind, it makes sense to try to look for ways to have the Afghan economy function where it can function largely without control of the Taliban, because it allows Afghans to feed themselves and to create jobs. I could go on, I won't, but there are a lot of these things where you're going to have to, my overall point is, you're not going to have a clear-cut policy for some time because we haven't got to do it. You do need pressure. You need pressure, especially on the women's issues, which are absolutely horrible. It would be nice, by the way, if the Afghan women had a little more support from Afghan men, which is noticeably lacking. It is extremely difficult to achieve anything with foreign support for Afghan women, which does not have Afghan domestic support from the male half of the population. That is also something we can't fix. But what I just want to leave you with is no silver bullet, no simple answer. Lots of small issues, every one of which will have pluses and minuses as you try to weigh this balance between keeping pressure on, maintaining contact, carrying out our responsibilities morally to Afghans. Thank you. If
Thank
that
you.
should have raised your confusion to a higher level of detail.
Thank you. Javed Ahmed, our last speaker here, is formerly Afghan ambassador to the United Arab Emirates and is presently a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. And he's also a non-resident scholar here at MEI. Previously, he has been a non-resident fellow with the Modern War Institute at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Javed has written extensively on the region, especially on developments in Afghanistan. He's worked with the U.S. defense community, including General Dynamics, where he provided security, counterterrorism, and economic analysis and assessment to U.S. government and business clients on South Asia and Central Asia. Javed?
Thank you, Marvin. It's great to be here. Just like Doug said, I'm also in violent agreement with what Lisa said and what Ambassador Newman said, although I would not use the word violent because as an Afghan, that could connote anything. And but nonetheless, what they said is pretty accurate. We have an ideological Taliban hermit kingdom in the making. And that is, effectively the truth. The way they have laid out the broader skeleton of the Taliban ideological state is something that we have known for quite a while, because this is effectively a transition, a Taliban transition from a former insurgent group into now effectively a ruling government in a ruling regime. But that is effectively the truth. I for my part, will not tiptoe around emotions. I mean, as Afghan, I mean, we are emotional. We are an emotional breed. But I also have to be, a bit more dispassionate and perhaps not tiptoe around those emotions, be a bit more objective. Now, I'll make a few points. The moral outrage that's displayed in public about the Taliban's action, this is, I mean, it's inexcusable. It makes perfect sense. It's unfortunately an oppressive, savage group. And anything we could say about the Taliban is effectively, or their actions, none of which is basically redeemable, and they have much to repent for. But everything we effectively say about the Taliban is in basically a futile exercise, and I told you so. We have known all of these things. Like, what did you expect that Taliban are going to do? We have known this as an insurgent group, but now also as a ruling regime. But the general view that I sense, at least in this capital, and I was just in Europe there as well, is that it's important not to destabilize the ruling regime, let alone let it to fail, mainly because there's an alternative to it. And once there's an alternative, then you readapt very easily. And then perhaps that's, the wider definition of the American and also the Western, the European in particular, definition of pragmatism or principle pragmatism. So for now, as I see it, the main US Taliban interest is to cooperate. That cooperation, as Doug mentioned, is happening, some over the table, some under the table. It's just that it's not publicly voiced or expressed. But that cooperation is happening. And I think in the months or ahead, we will also see that cooperation to become a lot more socialized in public spaces like this. Now, the Taliban operate in a very interesting way. Domestically, or even regionally and non-regionally, when there's a pressure on the Taliban, they, from the US, for example, whether it's on social issues, on security issues, they go ahead and then they take it up with the Afghans. So they pressure them. Then the Afghan complain about it, including to Western countries like the United States, and those complaints then gets echoed in capitals like this. And then we come back to that circle. So we are in our own vicious circle, and then we're just moving, and it's really hard to, do something to break that chain. So we are effectively at a hinge point here, unfortunately, mainly because between the Taliban and non-Taliban Afghans and between the region and non-regional forces, there's no sufficient consensus on the way forward. So I'll explain this in three parts. First, on the Afghan part. Now, as Afghans, we need to understand, and I think this is pretty clear, that when overthrows happen, you normally go through at least 4 stages. There's a sense of shock and numbness, which we saw. Then there is an awareness and acknowledgement of the reality. Then there's a beginning of a conversation as to what to do. People start to open up. And then, the fourth is that there is a collective sense that sets in on the way forward. Now, that collective sense could stay or could not stay. Now, if people conclude that the collective sense is that the Taliban is a problem, then they take action against them, perhaps even armed action. But if that collective sense on the Afghan part does not set in, then people accommodate. Now, this is where we are, unfortunately, is that in that we have not yet reached a sufficient consensus on what to do as Afghans with respect to the Taliban. Now, personally, I've long believed that Afghans are the best analysts of their own problems, mainly because they're living it. But the problem on our part is that, although most of us want the same thing, but we disagree on how to achieve it, and that includes our discussion on the Taliban or with the Taliban as well. And what we want is a semblance of stability, a semblance of political predictability. Now, that political predictability and maybe a semblance of security has been brought by the Taliban, at least for now. And as Afghans, we need to know, and we should learn by now that when the new reality dawns, whether it's the Taliban reality or non-Taliban reality, we need to basically adapt, and we need to adapt to the new context. We have not yet adapted to the new context, and that is our problem. Personally, I believe that the space for conversation among Afghans has really shrunk. There's no appetite or patience among Afghans to listen to one another. I'm talking about non-Taliban Afghans, and that's a problem on our part. Now, the actual baggage of our collective failure in Afghanistan is also incredibly strong. People will not move on. We are fighting against history, and because past has not become history for us. Unfortunately, past has become present for us, and that is our problem. The status quo of Taliban oppression is unacceptable to most Afghans, but the restoration of the former republic is also impossible. But in our own view, we are looking for a perfect solution, but none of those perfect solutions, unfortunately, exist. Our debate on the Afghan side has also become quite self-centered, very selfish, and also very zero-sum. And it's driven, again, as I said, by emotions, pointless and meaningless criticisms and complaining. And none of this, unfortunately, has any analytical value. And I think that is a paradox on our part, is that on the one hand, we complain about the West, we critique it, and then we also implore them to do something or not do something. But on the other hand, when they do something, we disagree with it. And I don't think that is the way forward. So that is on the Afghan part. Now, within the Taliban, as I said, they have a hermit kingdom in the making. They have placed themselves as the vanguard for true Islamic leadership. They have channeled Islamic nationalism into Afghan nationalism, mainly because they want to re-Islamize the Afghan society as a whole and to want to make it great again, because they believe that Afghanistan was never Muslim enough or Islamic enough, and that needs to happen. And to do so, they have adopted their own very toxic ideology as a force multiplier. So, and that has effectively become a currency. The emir sits at the top. Their overall approach to governance is that it's kind of flows between a triangle. You have the emir as a paragon of virtue. You have the mosque as a place of empowerment, and then you have the Taliban administration as the implementer. And everything basically flows and feeds off between these three elements. Their approach is incredibly originalist, the way they interpret Islamic law and man-made laws, because they believe man-made laws follows the whims of corrupt and mortal men, and God's laws are unimpeachable. But there's also no alternative to it, unfortunately. So it's a culture battle within the Taliban, and they have used it quite impressively to, as a force multiplier to re-Islamize the Afghan society. But that's what's happening. They do have their own problems. They need to, domestically, they need to reach some kind of a consensus on domestic and internal legitimacy, regional and non-regional legitimacy, but also Islamic legitimacy. And for that, you require some kind of accommodation among non-Taliban Afghans to accommodate with their version of Islam at some point, because they are the product of that environment. They have a staying power, political staying power, tactical staying power, and religious staying power. And there's no a viable alternative to it. So we will have to, as Afghans, accommodate to it. No one is going to volunteer a plane, not the US and others, mainly because that if anybody volunteers a plane, that comes with responsibility, and responsibility comes with accountability. No one will take that responsibility, and no one wants to be accountable for a regime like that. So that is a problem. Now, on the US side, final point is that, President Biden himself has said, if you read the national security strategy, he said, and I quote, that the United States does not believe governments and societies anywhere must be remade in America's image for us, the United States, to be safe, unquote. So if you read this, and you hear President Biden and others, they are threading a fine line between engagement and isolation. But to the extent that, this is my reading, that I understand it, it seems like the Taliban, despite their past, could become a great exception to normalization. And in many ways, they have become a great exception to normalization. If they are playing ball on the most important thing that matters to the United States, which is counterterrorism, do you think the United States will care what the Taliban is doing on women's rights issue? As Afghans, we need to understand this. It will happen because is women's rights a national security priority for the United States? I don't think it is. So at some point, sooner than later, all women's rights issues, human rights issues, will be left to Afghans themselves to determine, and that's why I think we need, as Afghans, we need to come to some kind of a good enough consensus on the way forward, because the more we wait, the stronger the Taliban will become, because we, on our part, on the US part at least, they're not doing enough to prevent Taliban's consolidation. In fact, they're not even doing enough to slow it down. So in this case, there has to be some kind of a diplomatic engagement, some kind of a diplomatic support facility, US diplomatic support facility, perhaps some kind of a counterterrorism liaison mission on the ground, because we need to talk to them. And that is my last point, is that we should not shy away from talking. We should talk to everybody, we should talk to the resistance, we should talk to the Taliban, we should talk to the Emir, most importantly, mainly because we need to understand them. And it's just talk, simple talk.
Thank you. Panelists, would you like to address remarks to any of the other panelists? Lisa.
Yeah, okay. So clearly I'm in the minority here, and I'll accept that. And, I have not said that we should break all contact with the Taliban. What I'm saying is we should condition the kind of engagement we're going to do on, policies that we want to see, because that is one of our very few points of leverage, is our engagement and our diplomatic recognition. So we should use that wisely and try to bring about the changes that we want to see. We also have to recognize that the US, for the terrible mistakes we made with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, still the international community does look to the United States as a leader in how they're going to engage the Taliban. So it's very important, how we do it. And I think we need to do it very carefully. But the second thing I want to say is that I haven't heard any examples of how our engagement has helped further US national security in the past. So why do we think it's going to be any different? We've been engaging with the Taliban for the last 4 years. I mean, before that, we were, of course, engaging sporadically, but we've been consistently engaging with Taliban since, Zal Khalilzad's effort in late 2018. And what has it gotten us? I don't think it's really gotten us very much. Okay, yes, we haven't had another attempted attack, stemming from Afghanistan, but we still have, Al-Qaeda leaders operating freely there. We can debate how many, but I just don't think I've heard any, if we're talking about strategy, what's our strategy for ensuring that our engagement gets us from point A to point B? And, I can understand why Joppa believes that US policymakers don't care about women's rights, because there have been little attention focused on that. And I've tried to make my point of why that is a mistake, because I think the way women are treated in Afghanistan directly impacts the terrorism trends that we're going to see in the region. But at the same time, I have to disagree, because I think that this issue is still important. It's important to Congress, and it's important to other people. And I don't think you can separate the two issues. I think it's a false choice that either we support human rights or we support counterterrorism efforts. It's a false choice. They're directly linked. We should, be able to have a policy that addresses both issues as we move forward.
Let me just interject here. Let's assume now that one of the problems in dealing with Taliban is the lack of mutual trust. That for whatever else there is, that if there were areas in which we could converge in our views, we just simply lack the kind of trust that would be necessary to move us forward. That being the case, could a case be made for trying to identify those things in what is now a relationship in the shadows? To try to elevate this, I think this is where Doug is coming from with his remarks. For example, you brought up before, Lisa, counterterrorism and how they'll follow their own lights as far as that. But for certain kinds of counterterrorism, the most effective way to do it is nevertheless, and I don't know whether we haven't had any communication already in that direction. We know formally they, for lack of trust, have said, no, we don't want to have any part of an arrangement with you. But if we took that, if we took also something else that's been said here, and that is that we both can recognize for different reasons why a stabilization of the Afghan community, economy rather, is in the mutual benefit, in fact, in everybody's benefit here, if what we're looking for are ways, for example, to create jobs. Absolutely critical here. So that even if we set aside, unfortunately, some issues, hot button issues, in which we're unlikely, they're unbridgeable at this point. Even if we set those aside, that perhaps with Doug's suggestion, we might be better able to identify, or maybe we wouldn't need that, but in any case, better identify where those opportunities are here for some levels of cooperation and a building of trust. And I single out counterterrorism, and another one that's been singled out was here, we do have to cooperate on the evacuation. And we have really seen a lot of cooperation for a time. It's been very intermittently given. And then finally, counterterrorism and the economy and this. So there are at least three issues on which perhaps we can build trust. Well, I throw it out for your reactions.
So I would just jump in to thank you for mentioning a couple of my comments, because the lack of trust is what I used to call job security, right? So it's actions, obviously, as I think Ambassador Newman mentioned as well. But I agree with Lisa that engagement should be based on conditions. Unfortunately, and as Ambassador Newman pointed out in his remarks, we've not been very good about conditions and setting them or sticking to them. But there is cooperation, right? There is cooperation in CT as a matter of currency. But we have to be realistic, as the United States does as a country, because it's a little hypocritical when we've bent over backwards to Saudi Arabia after candidate Biden called MBS pariah. We were going to prioritize human rights. People don't miss that. Taliban doesn't miss that. They understand that we're going to be thinking with our tangible interests, I think, as Javed pointed out very effectively. But that does not mean we can't set conditions that we make offers of carrots that are of interest to particularly some elements of the Taliban, not to all. Akhundzada, the Kandaharis, they don't want global engagement, is my opinion. They'd be just as happy to let people starve and be isolated and maintain power. I believe that. But the Haqqanis, they're business people. They got money to make. They got mouths to feed. They got people to keep in control. Hardly progressives, Lord knows not our friends, but we've dealt with Haqqanis over decades, during the Soviet invasion and since, when there are various hostage negotiations and such. So there's room to accommodate the need to apply conditions, but do it correctly. Throw out things that we know are going to be of interest to some elements of this less than homogeneous Taliban that could influence behavior, because after all, Akhundzada still has to retain power. And to your point, Ambassador, you're not going to know what's actually going on unless you've got engagement, unless you're on the ground, unless you're collecting intelligence, unless you have diplomatic conversations.
Before, go ahead, Ron, quickly.
A couple of points. One, I'm not sure you're as isolated as you might feel, Lisa, but anyway, I do not, one place I don't agree, and I'm not sure Javed means it quite the way he said it, but I don't agree that we will or can ignore the role of women. I think there are several reasons for that. One is practical politics. American domestic opinion is not going to ignore the role of women. No American administration is going to feel free to ignore that. The question is how much they do about it, how much it shows, but they're not going to ignore it. Secondly, while not everyone probably would agree, we have a moral responsibility. We spent 20 years making gender policy part of our policy, training people, helping people become women doctors, women lawyers, women judges, women policemen. You know, we helped put them there, by God. And there's something, you know, rather brutally callous about pretending that isn't our responsibility. In the case of the Biden administration, I think it's not that they think that isn't their responsibility, it's that they don't want to think about Afghanistan at all. This is one of their most embarrassing moments politically. They're going to get beat up about it continually from now till the election, if not beyond. And the last thing they want to do is have Afghan policy debates very publicly, or probably at all. I think they would. This is a real problem because people actually have to work on doing these things and getting these decisions made, have to deal in a context where people don't really want to make hard decisions, which is hard for the people doing it. I think, Lisa, you said, do we get anything? Well, yeah, I think we get some things. We do get, you know, if we give information, I don't know what we do in counterterrorism. I don't pretend that I do, and I don't want anybody to think that I do. But if hypothetically you give them a piece of information to strike a group and they strike it, that's fine. That's in our interest. Then you get something out of the contact. And if you don't have the contact, you can't give them that information. What you should not do is let other elements of your policy become a hostage to your contacts. So that because we have a contact, oh dear, we can't go bomb somebody else, or we can't take some other action. So then you tie yourself up in knots, and we're much better at doing that than they are. So that's where you have to be careful. But I would go, I don't know whether it's just, I would go beyond the issue of trust. I would say we do not understand each other.
True, too.
And we probably never will. But, you know, one thing that struck me that, you know, I as you said, I was ambassador there until 2007, but I went back every year from 2010. I was back actually about 6 weeks before the collapse. And you know, my first visit to Afghanistan was 1987, which is, my God, a half a century ago. But as much as I've learned in all those years, I've never been able to guess all of the conspiracy theories that Afghans would come up with about anything in particular. There was always a new one whenever you got back in contact. Some of them perfectly logical, maybe wrong. Some of them wildly illogical, but nonetheless believe. It doesn't matter. If you don't talk to people, you don't know that stuff. If you don't know that stuff, you can't deal with it. I had an Afghan friend tell me, maybe it was last year, he'd just been in Kabul. He'd seen 6 or 7 ministers. And people would say, well, are the Americans trying to bring us down, or would they like eventually to support? Well, of course, the answer is neither. There was no policy, is no policy of bringing them down, whether there should be or not. There are all kinds of domestic influences, the things you can't do. There's not a consistent policy there. There's a desire not to destabilize, but it's not a policy to help. But it's all, so much is driven by American domestic politics. The fact that those questions were coming at a ministerial level in Kabul is just, to me, an interesting evidence of how little they understand us. And now, would we get along any better if we understood them? Quite possibly not. But when you want to put pressures on, for instance, understanding is a key part of pressure. If they don't know at the broadest level, if your pressure is designed to get them to change a policy or designed to bring them down, you get totally different aspects of this.
Okay.
And that's real.
We really got to move on
Yeah.
to the question session if we can,
Okay.
because I promised, and we already have only about 20 minutes left. Okay, if you don't mind, okay, that's all right. But maybe in the course of your responding,
Then Lisa gets the last,
you can get it in.
Lisa gets the closing.
Because I've also got things I would follow up with. Jonathan. Re-identify yourself.
Yeah.
Identify yourself and go ahead, John.
Jonathan Landay, I'm a reporter with Reuters. A couple of weeks back, I broke a story on the fact that Haibatullah met with the Prime Minister of Qatar, held secret talks. And as far as I know, this was the first meeting that he has ever had with the head of a government, although I guess the emir in Qatar is the head of the government. I'm just wondering, given the shared impression that Haibatullah is not interested in global engagement. I know, Javed, you said that the Qatari brought a message from the United States government. I have not been able to confirm that, but I'm just wondering, if he's not interested in global engagement, why did he have this meeting? To what end might he have agreed to meet with the Qatari Prime Minister?
Anyone, any thoughts here?
Real quick, you don't have to want global engagement to want to protect your tail end. You want to know where threats are.
Just very briefly, I mean, just, before I answer your question, just very briefly on the previous point. Look, morals and values in the US systems are very compartmented. In the US system, I care about morals here, but I care about interests there. They're incredibly fickle. And so the fear on the part of Afghans is generally, including and particularly women, is that ultimately, those morals are going to get trampled. So Afghan human rights or women's rights are going to get trampled. So those are fears. Now, the onus falls on the shoulders of Afghans, men and women alike, to keep this conversation alive, right? But then, the United States also need to define whether women's rights issues, particularly those in Afghanistan or in oppressive societies like Afghanistan, are in fact a national security priority. This is my personal view, conservative view, is that it is not. When it's not, then that means that we need to think a bit more shrewdly and think beyond this outrage. That's one point. To your point about engagement, and to Doug's point, look, first of all, I never said that that they brought a message from the United States, but I admire the fact that there was an engagement. To Doug's point on whether or not the Taliban's isolation score, particularly those in Kandahar, are open to a dialogue or not, hasn't been tested. So we need to test that assumption. We need to take this conversation to the ground, whether it's done directly by the United States or through another authorized proxy, perhaps one that's trusted, at least trusted or seen, or have that semblance of trustworthiness on the part of the Taliban. And we need to take that. The idea is that we need to think a bit more unconventional. We need to think equally radical. They are radical. We need to think radicals, which means take this conversation directly to the halls of power in Kandahar. Now, it may well turn out that Mullah Hibatullah is open to a dialogue. Perhaps his version of a dialogue is that it needs to be conditions for a conditions basis. It means maybe he wants compliance for a compliance-based dialogue, right? But that assumption, what the isolationist core need to be tested, that hasn't been unfortunately tested yet. We don't understand this, right? Because we've been focusing on the pragmatic faction in Kabul. We have completely isolated the hardliners there, but also the wild cards, the unpredictable Taliban, and that needs to be tested. So
Yeah,
that's
look,
why
we really do have to move on. If it's okay, John.
sure.
Because there's so many people who want to ask a question. Brian.
Brian Katsoulis, I'm the Vice President of Policy here at MEI. First, I want to commend the panel for what I think has been a tremendous modeling of the sort of discussions we should have. While I was listening to your difference of views and the polite exchange of it, I had a reverie of similar panels on Israeli-Palestinian or Iran or US-Saudi relations. And it really is, you have different views, but you're expressing in a way that is based on policy. I want to ask a question that's a bit more political and about domestic politics, and maybe more directly to Javed and Doug. Assume that your policy proposal is taken by the Biden administration. How do you help them make the case to the American public and to Congress, and then in a divided landscape? We're in 2023 going to 2024. I raise this because about 10 years ago, when I was at a different think tank, we had done some work with USIP. Steve Hadley and John Podesta made a public case that in some ways made the argument for public engagement with the Taliban. There already had been engagement going on at the same time. And I remember even in 2012, in that context, Mitt Romney had a book that came out called No Apologies. There was an incident in 2011, November, where 24 Pakistanis were killed. And I talked to somebody at the White House and they said, we're running against the guy who says no apologies. We're not going to apologize for this incident. What are you thinking about? The point of the anecdote is back to the political case. And it's not just a crass one, because in our democratic system, to have effective policy, how do you insulate it? What's your best case? Do you take a page from how I saw President Trump during the negotiations, basically confusing a lot of people and in an erratic way? I'd love to hear Lisa's views on it. But how do you make that case for what could be, an interesting policy approach, but may not have domestic support?
Thank you. Briefly, who'd like to respond?
Do you want me to respond?
Please.
Well, first of all, I think on the US part, we need to define whether the Taliban or a clever enemy or an imperfect friend. It seems quite apparent to me that they're becoming a little bit of both. They are a clever enemy, but they're also becoming, at least on the security side, an imperfect friend, right? They would, use, some of those, groups that they have historically been allied with or have served under their protective umbrella as an insurance policy or as a tool of blackmail. But, they're also pretty pragmatic in that respect, ruthlessly pragmatic, that they will sell them out. Perhaps they, who knows, they may have even sold out al-Zawahiri. So in this case, so the US need to kind of define that. That's one. Second is you cannot do engagement without talking. And talking requires initiative, bold, unconventional initiatives, radical initiatives. And talking takes time, right? And you need to take the talking or the dialogue directly to the ground. Folks who believes that they're isolationist core may turn out to be the most pragmatic, perhaps ruthlessly pragmatic, but that assumption needs to be tested. And that's the point, is that the idea is to find common language. understand Taliban's priorities, including religious priorities, and find ways within those religious priorities where they could be nudged, where you could find areas of compromise, potential compromise. It may turn out that, they want compromise on certain things, but they would need to do that on compliance for compliance basis. That hasn't been tested yet. And so whether you do that directly, perhaps through state or through, the intelligence community, that's one thing. Or if you do it parallel through an authorized proxy like the United Nations, at least one that's, trusted. If the United States does it and you engage with the isolation corps in Kandahar or the hardliners, the religious hardliners, it doesn't mean that U.S. diplomats act like religious diplomats. It's just that you go there, you speak to them, you understand them, their religious priorities, and then find ways within that where they could be potentially nudged. That hasn't been tested.
Okay. Yeah, of course, we did speak to them in Doha. I'm talking about the negotiations. We spent a lot of time and we learned a lot about how they negotiate and how they respond. So it's not that we haven't had that close order. We came away very disappointed. Ron?
We don't look, go ahead. You got other people out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Samad.
Thank you.
There's a microphone coming.
It takes me back 45 years on and off these stages talking about should we not, did we do the right thing, did we not? But
You
I'm
and I
going to
go
leave
back
that.
45 years.
I was here 45 years ago, before the stingers were given. But so my point is that we talk about engagement, something that I myself as an Afghan have been dealing with for even before the fall of the Republic. I saw in my own way, I saw what the potential was, the risk, the collapse was going to happen. And so what do we need to do in order to at least avoid a disaster or avoid a total collapse and save something? But we messed up. And I'm not going to get into that. But right now, we need to look at what is possible and what is not possible. And so you have tried to address some of those issues. I think that there are certain things that Afghans need to do. Afghans need to talk to Afghans. And I'm not talking about those who continuously vilify each other. I'm talking about those who, in the middle of the road, understand what their country is about. So understanding is not just an American understanding of Afghanistan, it's also Afghans understanding Afghans in Afghanistan as well. And the Taliban understanding the other sides as well. And so how do you do that? Dialogue is needed, trust building is needed, consensus building is needed, all these pretty words. But at the beginning, you have to recognize each other. And we have come to the point we don't even recognize each other as human beings, as members of the same country, of the same society, of same shared history. So we have started movements to address those things amongst Afghans. I talked to Taliban indirectly through the media. I was on a channel today discussing what Mr. Biden has said and what Jake Sullivan said yesterday in the UK, and giving this impression to Afghans that they're okay with the way cooperation is taking place on CT. And, and my job was to send a message to the Afghan people, because for me, they are the core, the Afghan people. We have to have Afghan people-centric policies. And in order to do that, we need to understand what that means. And then we need to convey that through Afghans and through others to the Taliban. The same way that we need to convey what Islam or, the more moderate or the traditional way of what Islam meant in Afghanistan. So these are very deep discussions, very long, difficult, arduous discussions that we have to have. As far as America is concerned, one of the big questions that wasn't raised here is, if you do not engage, who else will engage? I mean, as diplomats, as thinkers, as analysts, there are others who are going to fill the void. There are others who are going to come and play their role, and they already are, you know that. So that's a huge question. My last question to you is, do you think that this realization by this administration, at a time when the environment is very political here, it's very partisan, there are elections coming up, there's only so much the United States is going to do. There's only so much the United States is going to publicly say it's going to do. For your own political, partisan issues. And so Afghanistan is going to be an issue for some and not for others. But on the CT issue, what Jake Sullivan said yesterday in the UK, saying that, we're watching and things are sort of okay, but we want to make sure that the Taliban adhere to the Doha process. So that this administration believes in the Doha process and the Doha agreement. And Mr. Biden, we all heard what he said. So is that a starting point? And then where do you go from there? And then how do you engage? And through whom do you engage? So these are all very, do you need back channels? These are all very pertinent, very technical questions that need mature discussions at a policy level. And I'm not sure if Washington is ready for that.
Samad, I'm going to take that more as a comment than a question, unless someone here has.
I'll give a 1 minute
Yeah.
answer. First of all, we were talking to the wrong people in Doha. The Taliban 5, the former defense minister, they had no connectivity to the decision makers there. I think being on the ground now, or the people we're speaking to now, when we talk to CT, we're speaking to people, at least on CT, who are involved with CT. And whatever room they have has to be coming from higher authority.
We have a lot, thank you. We have a lot of questions here, and I want to get back to the audience here. We have a lot of questions here that have come in through Zoom, our Zoom connection. Let me pick out one of them here. Laura Jurgensen asks about what's the possibility of internal civil groups rising up against challenging the Taliban? And I might add to that, or with that, what's the real possibility of armed resistance groups? And that raises a further question. If they are serious, should we be supporting them? Any thoughts about this?
Oh, I'm sure we all have thoughts.
Yeah.
How long are you going to take us?
Yeah, can I just?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I don't think we should be providing arms or assistance to, material assistance for resistance. That, is not the policy that we should pursue. However, we should be engaging with any kind of resistance groups. And this will put pressure on the Taliban. They crave recognition. I believe we should reopen the Afghan embassy in Washington, but not staff it with Taliban, staff it with, maybe previous diplomats. But I think, we have to find ways to put pressure on the Taliban. And, I think this is one of the ways you do it. You engage with other opposition leaders, other resistance leaders. You're not, supporting them militarily, but you are giving them a voice because they're part of Afghanistan as well. The Taliban does not represent most Afghans. And I don't believe that Afghans must accommodate the Taliban and their ideology. I just fundamentally disagree with that. And I think that the US does have other options. Okay, fine, we want to engage at some level, but we don't have to accommodate the Taliban. It's our assistance, it's our diplomatic recognition, and we can adhere to our principles and our values, and we can decide to engage with a variety of people. And we shouldn't be just limiting ourselves to engagement with the Taliban. So yeah, I think we should be speaking with opposition groups and talking to them, not necessarily providing them material support.
Of course, if we were on the ground there, we would have a very better opportunity to do just that.
Well,
Maybe.
Maybe.
But anyway,
not necessarily.
Well,
Not necessarily.
If not there, then we're, okay.
anyway, couple points. I think we should engage with the opposition. I think we should engage with everybody. I don't think we have ever, US national interest has never been harmed by getting information. It has been frequently harmed by what we were ignorant about. So we should talk to everybody. We agree. I'm fine with the pressures on the Taliban. I think most of the real pressure on the Taliban will come internally. And it will come, and this is a long question, and raised a lot of the points of it. There's a tension right now between the fact that life is a bit more secure, at least if you have enough to eat. And that mitigates against people rising up. And at the other hand, there are all kinds of things the Taliban will do to aggravate people. And where that comes out is that's a balancing thing. And I certainly can't calculate it. There are all kinds of things that could cause big aggravation. Two of them right now. One, the move of TTP to the north. It's going to really piss off a whole lot of people if it is really large, if they start taking land, taking houses. And the suppression of drugs, which has cost a lot of livelihood, but which was resisted fairly successfully in Badakhshan. And that may raise lots of questions in other places about, hey, wait a minute, they got away with it. Can I do it? So this future is not something you can look at and say it's immutable for any direction. That's why you have to be open, able to react for a lot of things.
Dana, short question, Dana.
To poll the panel, thanks very much. I wanted to poll the panel to see if they would agree that, if, let's say, some commercial initiatives could be developed that could have some promise about actually providing funds to Afghan families for in small industrial facilities, but that would require some contact with the Taliban and perhaps even some sharing of tax revenue with Taliban. Would they be opposed to moving in that direction?
That's an interesting question.
In theory,
Could you
it
speak
would.
up, please?
All right, I will just say, one, in theory, yes, there's a value in helping Afghans. In practice, you get into so many permutations of money leaking, of corruption, of favoritism, and of who does what. It is so difficult to regulate that I would be very, very hesitant to get a US government program involved, because I think you will not be able to control it. You will not be able to know where it goes, and you will be seriously embarrassed
Well,
later
if
on.
we don't have it as a US program. That is.
Would I be in favor of somebody else falling into this pit? Certainly.
I think it's a commercial program, right? Not in the 202 area code. Businesses doing this, not the government.
If the businesses could deal directly with the Afghan people and go directly to the local
Right.
population, I
That's
would
the point.
support that. I wouldn't support, any support for the Taliban regime.
if I
I would
get you
agree
clear-
with some sort of microfinancing that
Yeah,
devil being in the
that would be one
detail
example. right?
for Afghans along the lines of Lisa
Yeah.
Ambassador Newman.
Okay, look, we've pretty much run out of time, and I've got these questions here. Okay, quickly.
Okay, first I have a comment, and I think a big dilemma is
Take the mic, please.
the hack up of lack of information and communication between the West international community and Afghan community. Still, I claim that the anthropology and the reading of the Afghan community is not that easy to read, just only an article or a book, or spend a few months in Afghanistan and claim that you are specialists, and that's why you make policies. That's a huge, huge dilemma. And I'm so sorry that there is a problem between the access to the typical Afghans data because of security reasons and some other reasons. That's why there is a huge gap. That's why the formula is always giving the wrong result. If we do not have the real data, then we cannot find the real dots. If we do not have the real dots, then the parable or the shape or the structure will be wrong. And that's why we are defining the wrong parable or the wrong shapes to the community in general public. So in this regards, we can contribute voluntarily since we are from Afghanistan. We want to contribute for our country. That's why if anybody needs some real data with challenging, then we can find them the real data, anthropology and chemistry of the country. So I'm really sorry for that if I'm rude, but I can tell because I read a lot of articles and I'm laughing while they're talking about Afghanistan. Oh my God, still they don't know Afghanistan. For example, right now it's called the Kandahari. It's not only Kandahar. Kandahar is only geography. We have religious problem, we have ethnicity problem. For example, Karzai is from Kandahar region and Bulaumar is from Kandahar region. How come we say Kandaharism? For example, if we say Loya Pakta, Ghanis from Lower Paktia and Haqqanis from Lower Paktia. Still, they're fighting with each other. So it means that's not geography, there is ethnicity. For example, if I say there is some, Javed is here, we have Nurzi in Atsakzi. Now there is fighting between Nurzi and Atsakzi, both is from Kandahar. So in this regard, I have some concern regarding that. If anytime we have time, we
I
can talk
take
about it.
that more as a comment unless anyone,
Well,
but
I would
an
just say-
interesting comment. Let's end now because we have run out of time with a question from viewers. Shah Mahmoud Mahal has raised the question because it is something that the opposition, that is the opposition outside of Afghanistan, talks about all the time, and that is an inclusive process. That somehow, if we ought to be investing in something which would bring all the Afghans together. What's the likelihood of this U.S. support, outright support for a more inclusive process?
I do want to make a comment because Samad put his finger on it. Afghans have to talk to Afghans.
Yeah.
Yes, there needs to be an inclusive process. No, the foreigners cannot make the inclusive process. The foreigners have never been able to make the inclusive process. They weren't able to keep the various mujahideen groups together, except to the extent that you could tie them down for arms. And the problem of Afghans has been repeatedly, a problem, there are a lot of problems, but a problem is that they keep splintering. So you had some very interesting youth movements that came up over the years, 14th 100 movement and others that had promise, and they break apart. And yes, inclusion is enormously important. And if it ever happened, it would be great to have pressure behind it. But the idea that the foreigners, what that is asking the foreigners to pick the Afghans they like. And that has been a constant problem. And it's natural because the foreigners are so damn dominant, have been for 40 years in what happens. But the idea that the foreigners can make or help or console or congeal the Afghans into a cohesive process. Yes.
Could I just very briefly,
Yes.
Marvin, look, among the non-Taliban Afghans, and Omar mentioned this, we have a crisis of coexistence. It has nothing to do with the Taliban. Of course, the Taliban is the catalyst in between because we disagree on the way of engagement or non-engagement with the Taliban. But amongst ourselves, we have this crisis, and it's an Afghan problem ultimately, and it's not America's problem. America could not find a solution for this because among every 2 Afghans, you have 5 opinions. And it's really difficult to reconcile as to what we want. So ultimately, if there is some kind of a process, a facilitated process, be it facilitated by the U.S. or another country or the UN, for example, it has to take that into account. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't speak to one side and then ignore the other side. Just like it was mentioned before, Ambassador Newman said this before, we should talk to everybody, resistant group, for example, because, ultimately, if they are part of that environment, they call themselves resistance for a reason, even though, that resistance may be quite virtual, but the idea is that among non-Taliban Afghans is that we need to have an affirmative message, some kind of a sufficient good enough consensus, central organization, and a semblance of a plan. That's sellable to Afghans, or at least widely accepted. And at the same time, we need to engage with the isolationist core within the Taliban, be it in the Lower Kandahar or Lower Paktia elsewhere, because if there's further intransigent or stubbornness or resistance from that side for non-engagement, then I would say the urgency and the need to support anti-Taliban resistant group becomes imperative.
Yes, thank you. And our time has run out and we've overrun our time. So I want to thank naturally our panel, most of all here, for coming this afternoon and really providing a very, I thought, illuminating discussion. So thank you. Thanks to the audience here. Good questions. And again, I'm sorry that we haven't entertained more from the remote, but we did get two, among others, we got two very good ones. So what more can we say is that this conversation, I'm sure was going to be going on for a long time. And let's hope that during this time, we make some progress towards some consensus here on ways forward with the Taliban. And again, thank you